Keddie, California, was never meant to be remembered. It was a small, forgotten mountain town surrounded by pine trees, narrow roads, and silence that stretched for miles. In 1981, Keddie wasn't a place where crimes happened. It was a place people passed through, or stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Cabin 28 sat slightly apart from the others, a modest wooden structure inside the Keddie resort, worn down by time, cold winters, and neglect. Nothing about it suggested violence. No history, no warnings. Just another quiet cabin in a quiet town. Inside lived Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old single mother trying to start over. Life hadn't been kind to her. She had left an abusive marriage, moved constantly, and struggled financially. Keddie wasn't a dream. It was a last option. Sue lived there with her children, John Sharp, 15, Sheila Sharp, 14, Tina Sharp, 12. They shared the cabin with Dana Wingate, 17, John's friend. On the evening of April 11th, 1981, everything appeared normal. Neighbors reported no screaming, no arguments, no signs of fear. The kids watched television. Laughter came from the cabin earlier that night. Sue planned to go to bed early. It was cold outside, quiet, still. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that by morning, Cabin 28 would become the site of one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history. Because whatever happened that night didn't come from chaos. It came quietly. No forced entry was ever found. No broken windows. No signs of a struggle outside the cabin. Whoever entered Cabin 28 was either invited in or already known. And by the time the sun rose over Keddie, 3 people would be dead, 1 child would be missing, and 2 others would sleep through it all, untouched, unaware, alive. This wasn't a random act. It wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't simple. This was something far darker. And it began in silence. Whatever happened inside Cabin 28 did not announce itself. There was no chaos spilling into the night, no sounds that carried through the trees, no neighbors waking up in fear. The cabin remained quiet. Investigators later determined that the events inside unfolded without panic, without resistance that reached beyond the walls. The people inside did not have time to react in a way that would alert anyone outside. This detail would become one of the most troubling parts of the case. Inside the living room, the television remained on. Furniture was undisturbed. Nothing suggested a struggle that moved through the cabin. Everything stayed contained, controlled. When investigators later examined the scene, they noticed something unsettling. The way the victims had been left suggested intent, not disorder. This was not a moment that spiraled out of control. It followed a sequence. After everything was over, the scene was not abandoned carelessly. Coverings had been placed over the bodies. This detail mattered. In many investigations, this action is associated with familiarity, or at least recognition of the people involved. It suggests the person responsible did not want to leave the scene in chaos, even after irreversible harm had been done. Then came the detail no one could explain. In the nearby bedroom, 2 girls slept through the entire night. They were not disturbed, they were not approached, they were not aware of what had happened, only steps away. When morning came, they would wake up to a reality that made no sense, a night that passed silently, while everything changed. But the most disturbing absence was yet to be discovered. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, was gone. Her bed showed signs that she had left during the night. Her personal belongings were missing. There was no sign that she had left on her own. This was not an escape. This was removal. Someone had taken her from the cabin, calmly, quietly, and without leaving a clear trail. And that meant something critical. Whoever was responsible didn't rush. They weren't afraid of being seen, and they believed they had time. The morning of April 12, 1981 began like any other in Keddie. The air was cold. The town was quiet. Nothing about the outside of Cabin 28 suggested that anything was wrong. Inside, 2 girls woke up. At first, there was only confusion. The living room looked different. The television was still on. The blankets on the floor didn't make sense. Something felt off, but not yet terrifying. When they realized what they were seeing, panic set in. They ran outside, screaming for help. Neighbors rushed over. One of them, a man staying nearby, entered the cabin. What he saw convinced him immediately that this was not something he could handle. Law enforcement was called, but from the very beginning, mistakes were made. The cabin was not sealed off right away. People moved through the space. Neighbors entered, some left again. Potential evidence was unknowingly disturbed before investigators fully arrived. When officers finally took control, they documented 3 deceased individuals inside the living room. They also noticed something equally alarming. Tina Sharp was missing. Her disappearance shifted the case instantly. This was no longer just a violent crime. It was now an active search for a child who could still be alive. Search teams combed the area around Keddie. Forests, roads, trails, and nearby properties were checked. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers joined in. Nothing was found. No footprints leading away from the cabin. No clear direction of travel. No sign of where Tina had gone. As investigators worked the scene, more troubling details emerged. The layout of the cabin suggested familiarity. The person responsible knew where things were. They moved confidently through the space. There were no signs of confusion or hesitation. Even more disturbing, the crime appeared to have taken place without waking the entire cabin. This reinforced a terrifying conclusion. Whoever did this was calm. They were deliberate, and they were not afraid of being interrupted. By the end of the day, news spread beyond Keddie. Reporters arrived. Rumors began to grow. The small town was suddenly the center of something it could never escape. But despite the attention, despite the search, despite the shock, there were no arrests, and Tina Sharp was still gone. As the days passed, the investigation into Cabin 28 began to unravel. Despite the seriousness of the case, progress slowed almost immediately. Leads were missed, tips went unpursued, and crucial early momentum faded. One of the first issues was jurisdiction. Keddie was a small town with limited resources. Local law enforcement was suddenly responsible for a case far beyond their experience. Outside agencies offered help, but coordination was inconsistent and information was not always shared clearly. Attention quickly turned to people close to the victims. Sue Sharp's past was examined. Her former husband was questioned. Neighbors were interviewed. Friends and acquaintances were scrutinized. But one name stood out more than the rest. A man connected to the area, someone who had access, familiarity, and a history of troubling behavior. Multiple witnesses later claimed this individual made disturbing statements in the days following the incident. Statements that suggested knowledge no outsider should have had. Even more concerning, reports surfaced that this person may have been seen near Cabin 28 around the time everything happened. Yet, despite these red flags, no arrests followed. Evidence connected to potential suspects was mishandled. Some items were lost, others were never fully analyzed. Important interviews were delayed, sometimes by years. At one point, recordings that could have clarified key details were reportedly erased. Then there was the question of the missing child. Tina Sharp remained unaccounted for, and as time passed, hope began to fade. Search efforts slowed. Public attention shifted. The case quietly slipped from urgency to uncertainty. Behind the scenes, frustration grew. Investigators who later reviewed the file described it as incomplete, disorganized, filled with gaps that should never have existed. Some believed the truth was missed early, buried beneath mistakes that could no longer be undone. Others believed something worse, that the right person had been known and allowed to walk away. 3 years passed, the cabin was abandoned. The town moved on, at least on the surface. But one question never left Keddie. What happened to Tina Sharp? In 1984, nearly 70 miles away from Cabin 28, a discovery was made in a remote wooded area. What was found confirmed what many had feared, but it did not bring clarity, closure, or justice. Instead, it raised even more questions. There were no clear answers about how Tina got there. No witnesses, no confirmed timeline. No explanation for why she was taken or why she was left so far from home. By the time this discovery was made, the original investigation had already lost its momentum. Evidence from the early days was incomplete, memories had faded. People who once might have known something were no longer talking, or were no longer alive. The case quietly shifted from active investigation to cold file. Years later, independent investigators and journalists revisited the evidence. They uncovered missed opportunities, overlooked statements, and failures that could never be corrected. Again and again, the same conclusion surfaced. The truth may have been reachable, but only in the beginning. Today, the Keddie Cabin murders remain officially unsolved. No one has ever been held accountable. No courtroom has heard the full story, and no verdict has ever been delivered. Cabin 28 no longer stands. It was torn down years ago, as if removing the structure could erase what happened inside. But some places don't disappear that easily, because this case isn't just about what happened in one cabin. It's about silence, about mistakes, about how easily justice can slip away when time is wasted, and about a small town that still carries a question it cannot answer. Who walked away from Cabin 28, and why were they never stopped?